Well, we are going to go ahead and jump into week 3 of our series, A Tale of Three Kings. So what we've been doing over the past couple of weeks is looking at different kings and looking at their kingdom and learning how things about their lives apply to us here and now. In week 1, Benji did a great job, and he talked about King Saul. And this was a king that started off real great, but ended up not so great. And he talked about that and contrasted that with the life of his predecessor, David, and talked about that contrast there and got us to challenge and think about our lives and how we're living. Last week, we talked about another one of Israel's king, a guy by the name of Absalom, a king that's less well known, a king that didn't reign very long, but whose life was really a tragic life. His story was a tragic one. And we learned what happens when we don't address the heart issues in our lives. What happens when those things go unchecked and we don't address those things, the impact that can have on us and those around us. So today we're looking at another king, and I was going through thinking about what king we should talk about, and I was thinking about all these different things, and I thought, to wrap this series up, let's just end with one of the greatest kings that have ever lived, one of the wisest, whose kingdom continues today and continues to make an impact on our world today, and that's none other than Jesus, the King of Kings. So I thought, when in church, you can end with Jesus. Yeah, it's like, and just FYI, if anybody ever asks you a question in church, just go with Jesus. Like, you can never go wrong with that. Like, Dan, what do you think about that? Jesus, so that's where I went with my king today. And I got to thinking about the impact that Jesus has had on our society, that Jesus has had on culture. And Christianity and the kingdom that Jesus set up has had such a massive impact on our world that sometimes we don't even realize it. First and foremost, human history is divided by times before Jesus and the time after Jesus. And then as we look at Jesus, his teachings, the church that he established, there's been such an impact on the world today. Many of our hospitals, most of our understanding of medical care today really started out of the church, wanting to care for those who are sick. That started because of the church. So many more things from art to architecture, to philosophy, to philanthropy. So many things, literature, the sciences. There was a study that was done, and out of all the Nobel Prize laureates between 1901 and 2000, over 65% claimed as their kind of personal religion, one degree or another, to be followers of Jesus, to be Christians. This world has been so impacted by the church, and not just broad segments, but even narrow segments of the world. For instance, women. The church has been responsible for outlawing things like from slavery to infanticide to polygamy, all these things, and helping give women the right to vote, helping end slavery. There's even been segments of society that Christianity has gone to those corners and lifted up the rights of those people. Human history has been so impacted by the church and by the kingdom of Jesus that many of us don't even realize the impact in our world today. And as I was thinking about this, getting ready for this, I stumbled across this book that was really, really intriguing, and it talked about this idea of the influences on modern society. It's a book by Michael Hart, and it's called The 100, and it's a ranking of the most influential people throughout human history. And this book's really fascinating. He spends about a page and a half on each person, talking about the impact that they've made and the reasons why. And as you go through this book, what does everyone do? You go to number 1, right? You go all the way to the back. And you're like, okay, what are the top people? In the top 10, there's people like Albert Einstein, St. Paul, Johann Gutenberg. Think about the impact that the creation of the printing press has had on modern society. Or the telephone. You go back to some of them, it's like, I wish they could de-invent the smartphone sometimes. But, the impact that some of these inventions have had on our lives is massive. And as I was thinking about Jesus and the church and the impact that that's had on modern society, I completely expected Jesus to be at number 1. Because 1, he's also, God. But as I looked at this, I realized that this isn't a Christian writing this book. This is just someone objectively looking at the influence each person has had on the world. And I was shocked that Jesus wasn't number 1. And I was surprised that Jesus wasn't even number 2. But in Michael Hart's list, Jesus comes in 3rd. Now here's the thing. This is just one person's opinion. And at first I disagreed. But then as I read his explanation, I was challenged and rocked to the core. See, Michael Hart even acknowledged kind of the controversy in putting Jesus at number 3. He even referenced that in his book. He said this. He said, the impact of Jesus on human history is so obvious and so enormous that few people would question his placement near the top of this list. Indeed, the more likely question is why Jesus, who is the inspiration for the most influential religion in history, has not been placed first. He's saying, I get it. I understand the controversy. But then he goes on to talk about what he deems to be the most distinctive teaching in all of Jesus' ministry. And he goes to the Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most famous sermons, a sermon that philosophers and people look at for millennia to this day. Many people say that's the most ethical teaching that people can find. And he looked at that and he looked at teachings like to turn the other cheek and to pray for those who persecute you, and to actually love your enemy. And he looked at those teachings. And then he looked at society today. And he had this to say. Now these ideas, which were not a part of Judaism of Jesus' day, nor most other religions, are surely among the most remarkable and original ethical ideas ever presented. And if they were widely followed, I would have had no hesitation in placing Jesus first in this book. But the truth is that they are not widely followed. In fact, they are not even generally accepted. Most Christians consider the injunction to love your enemy as, at most, an ideal, which might be realized in some perfect world, but one which is not reasonable guide to conduct in the actual world we live in. We do not normally practice it, do not expect others to practice it, and do not teach our children to practice it. Jesus' most distinctive teaching, therefore, remains an intriguing but basically untried suggestion. And when I read that, I was rocked. Because honestly, I kind of agree. Now, this person isn't saying that those teachings on the Sermon on the Mount are Jesus' most important teachings or the things that are most valuable or most often taught, but he's saying they're the most distinctive teachings. That those things, Jesus stands apart from the crowd in those teachings. And he says, if the church would widely accept those teachings, to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to turn the other cheek, to look for reconciliation instead of retribution, to return good for evil, if we did that, Michael Hart argues that Jesus would surely be number 1 on his list. So it got me thinking about this. Got me thinking about the teachings of Jesus. What are the things that Jesus elevates? What are the things that are really important seemingly to him? See, I'm challenged by this. You see, because when you look at the specific teachings of Jesus, too often the church chooses to major on the minors and minor on the majors. Too often we elevate things and make big deals of things that Jesus in his teachings doesn't seem to make big deals of. And there are other times that there are things that Jesus really majors on, really says, hey guys, this is important. And the church just kind of minors on those things, mentions those things as an aside, but that's not their primary focus. But I get it, you might disagree. You might say, Dan, I don't really agree with what you're saying because of church I've been a part of, I think we major on